The rain was relentless, a fine mist that drifted down from a sky smothered in low, heavy clouds. It slicked the narrow alley in a sheen of black glass, catching and distorting the dim yellow glow from a lone street lamp at the far end. The air was cold enough to sting, and every sound was amplified. The distant hiss of tires on wet asphalt, the drip, drip, drip from a gutter somewhere above, the faint rustle of refuse shifting in the shadows. She stepped carefully, her boots making small splashes in the shallow puddles that had collected along the cracked pavement. Her pace was quick, purposeful. This wasn't the kind of place where you lingered. Not at night, not alone. The walls of the alley loomed high on either side, brick scarred by time and graffiti, trapping the air and making it feel closer, heavier. Halfway down, she caught a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. A subtle shift in the shadows, so slight she almost dismissed it as her imagination. Almost. She slowed, her pulse tightening, and looked ahead. That was when he stepped out. It was a deliberate movement, unhurried but decisive, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. His figure emerged from the darkness between two dented trash bins, a man in a long fangia, dark coat, shoulders squared, head tilted slightly forward. A low brim hid most of his face, but his eyes, she could see them clearly even in the poor light. Cold, focused. And in his hand, pointed directly at her chest, was the gun. She froze mid-step, her body reacting before her mind caught up. The air seemed to thicken between them, each breath harder to take. The metallic gleam of the weapon drew her gaze like a magnet. The barrel was small, almost unremarkable, and yet it was the most dangerous thing she had ever seen. Her heart thudded once, hard enough to echo in her ears. They didn't speak, not at first. The sound of the rain filled the space between them, a steady whisper that somehow made the silence heavier. She could hear her own breathing, controlled but shallow. His was silent, measured, as if even that was under his command. Her eyes swept over him, taking in every detail. The faint sheen of water on his coat, the tight set of his jaw, the way his shoulders didn't move except for the slight rise and fall that betrayed he was alive and not some shadow come to life. His stance was steady, but there was something about the way he held the gun, not sloppy, not amateurish, but not quite professional either. It was personal. She didn't know why that thought hit her so strongly, but it lodged in her mind like a shard of glass. This wasn't random. The alley seemed to shrink around them. The distant city noises faded until it was just the two of them in this narrow slice of the world. A tableau suspended in time. Predator and prey, both waiting for the other to move. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but the logical part of her brain knew the truth. There was nowhere to go. So she stood still. Every second stretched impossibly long. Her mind ticked through questions in rapid succession. Who is he? Why here? Why me? She studied his eyes again, searching for a clue, but they gave away nothing. Until they did. It was small, so subtle she almost missed it, the faintest flicker, as if something in her presence had caught him off guard. His grip on the gun didn't loosen, but she could feel the tiniest shift in his focus. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, not in fear but in thought. If there was even the smallest crack in whatever resolve had brought him here, maybe, just maybe she could wedge her way in before the moment shattered. But for now, she stayed silent. The rain kept falling, blurring the edges of the world. Somewhere far behind her, a siren wailed faintly before fading into the distance. A bead of water slid from the brim of his hat, dripping to the ground in the narrow space between them. It landed with a sound that seemed impossibly loud, the tiniest punctuation in the tense sentence they were both trapped inside. She knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't a robbery. The gun wasn't pointed at her wallet or her watch. It was aimed at her heart. And whoever he was Whatever he wanted, it wasn't money. The cold metal remained fixed on her, unwavering, and yet her gaze didn't drop. She met his eyes fully, now refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing fear there. If he was going to pull the trigger, she wanted him to see the truth in hers before he did. The alley held its breath. The air between them felt electric, alive with something she couldn't name yet. The rain's soft percussion against the brick walls created a rhythm, but it was drowned out by the thudding of her own heart. The man in front of her didn't move, not even an inch, but there was a shift so subtle it was almost imperceptible. The weight of his stare. It was the kind of shift you feel more than you see. She held his gaze, refusing to look away. She needed to understand who he was and why this was happening. The world outside the alley might as well have ceased to exist. There was no city, no street lamps, no distant traffic. Only him, the gun, and the strange tug at the edges of her memory. And then it hit her. It wasn't his face exactly. Most of it was obscured by shadow and the brim of his hat, and what little she could see looked different, older, harder, shaped by a life that had stripped away softness. But the eyes. She'd seen them before. It was the kind of recognition that came not from sight, but from something deeper, like the echo of a voice you once loved, or the scent of a room from your childhood home. Her mind reached for it, flipping through old memories like brittle photographs, but the image wouldn't come into focus. Still, she knew, absolutely knew, that somewhere in her past, those eyes had looked at her in a different way. They had looked at her with warmth once. The thought made her chest tighten. She searched his face again, her own eyes narrowing slightly, testing this fragile theory. If she was wrong, she'd be giving away nothing but time. But if she was right, the rain intensified for a moment, rattling down in a heavy burst, masking the faint hum of the city beyond. She could almost imagine that the alley itself was bending closer, listening. He didn't speak. Not a threat, not a demand, not even a warning. Just that unbroken, frozen stare. And that silence told her something it wasn't hesitation from fear or uncertainty. It was the kind of hesitation born from recognition. Her pulse skipped. He knows me too. A flicker of something, pain? Regret? Passed across his face, so fast she might have imagined it. His hand adjusted slightly on the grip of the gun, not loosening but not quite as steady as before. That was all she needed. The realization settled heavily in her chest. This was not an accident, but it wasn't entirely by his choice either. Whatever had brought him here, whatever orders or intentions he carried, there was history beneath it. And if she could reach that history, maybe she could survive this. A memory stirred, faint but persistent, a summer years ago, somewhere green and sunlit. She was younger, carefree, standing in a field with someone beside her. Someone who had those same eyes, though back then they had laughed easily. She remembered the warmth of a hand in hers, the sound of a promise made in a voice she could know. Longer quite here. Could it be him? The thought sent a strange mix of fear and hope rushing through her veins. She wanted to speak, to say his name out loud, but the timing had to be perfect. One wrong word, one wrong breath, and the moment could snap back into violence. He blinked, slow and deliberate, as if he were studying her just as carefully. It wasn't the look of a stranger deciding whether to kill. It was the look of someone fighting against something heavier than a simple choice. In the space between heartbeats, she felt the bond, that invisible thread that had once connected them, stretch across the years and wrap, however faintly, around this terrible moment. She didn't know why he was here or what had twisted his life into this shape. But she understood one thing. This man pointing a gun at her chest was not entirely her enemy. And if she could find the right words, she could make him remember that too. The rain softened again, tapering into a gentle hiss on the pavement. She inhaled slowly, her eyes locked on his. Feeling the gravity of the choice she was about to make dawn in her mind, she tested his name. It felt right, heavy with memory. She didn't speak it yet, but she could almost taste the way it would land. In the air between them. Not yet. For now, she kept her voice silent and her stance still, watching for the next flicker in his expression, the moment when the past would push harder against the present, and she would take her chance. The alley felt like a stage, and the next act was hers to begin. The rain's rhythm became a kind of metronome, steady and hypnotic as she stared into those eyes. The longer she looked, the harder it became to keep the present and the past from overlapping. Shapes began to form in her mind, not quite memories yet, but pieces of something that felt too real to be imagination. Her breath came slower now, not because the danger had passed, but because she was slipping into a place where time didn't move in a straight line. The alley blurred at the edges, her focus narrowing to the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his shoulders tensed and relaxed in an almost imperceptible rhythm. She knew that rhythm. It belonged to someone he used to stand beside. Her. The image began with light sunlight so warm it painted the world gold. A summer afternoon. She could see herself younger, barefoot in a field where tall grass swayed in the breeze. A boy stood a few feet away, his hair messy from the wind, his hands stuffed awkwardly into the pockets of worn jeans. He was smiling. In that way boys do when they're trying to hide it, but can't. They had been inseparable that summer. She didn't remember how it started, only that one day they had met by chance, and from that day on, they had found each other without needing to make plans. He had a laugh that rolled out of him easily, and he looked at her like she was more than just a girl, like she was something rare, something worth holding on to. She remembered the games they played, making up stories about the world beyond. The fields, pretending they were explorers, heroes, anything but two kids from a town too small to matter. They had shared secrets in the fading light of long evenings, about fears, about dreams, about promises to never forget each other. Then, as memories often do, the light shifted. The warm summer glow dimmed into the gray of a different day. The air had been thick with the smell of rain then too, though no drops had fallen yet. She had been waiting for him at their usual place, but when he finally appeared, something was wrong. His face was pale, his eyes too wide, and there was a tension in his movements that made her stomach twist. "I have to go," he'd said. At first, she'd thought he meant just for the day. But when she asked when he would be back, he didn't answer. Not really. He'd only said her name once, in a way that felt like goodbye, and then he was gone. She never saw him again. Until now. The realization hit her with such force that she almost stepped back. But she didn't. She couldn't, not when every instinct told her the wrong move could shatter the fragile thread between them. Her eyes searched his face again, comparing the man in front of her with the boy in her memory. The smile was gone. The softness was gone. But the eyes, they were the same. She knew his name now. She could hear it in her head as clearly as if he had just introduced himself yesterday. The sound of it was tangled with all the laughter and all the goodbyes they had shared. It tasted of dust and sunlight and loss. The gun in his hand didn't seem like an extension of him anymore. It seemed like something foreign, something that didn't belong to the boy she'd once known. Which meant something had put it there. Her pulse picked up again, but this time not from fear alone. There was anger in it too. Not at him, exactly, but at the years and the forces that had taken him from her and molded him into the stranger standing in the rain. He still hadn't spoken, but his breathing had changed. She could hear it now, faint but uneven, like he was standing at the edge of a decision and wasn't sure which way to fall. She thought of all the promises they had made in the fading light of that summer. The one that stood out now was the simplest. "I'll always know you," and she did. Her lips parted, the shape of his name already forming, but she held it back one heartbeat longer. The rain dripped from his hat brim in steady intervals, and she realized she was waiting for the exact right drop, the exact right moment, when the sound of her voice might pierce the armor he'd built over the years. The boy, she remembered, was still in there. She just had to reach him before the man with a gun pulled the trigger. The rain seemed to quiet as she stood there. Though she knew it hadn't, it was still falling, still tapping against the brick walls and pooling at their feet. But something in her mind had tuned it out, narrowed her hearing until all she could focus on was the faint rasp of his breathing and the slow, deliberate movements of his fingers on the gun. She had rehearsed the sound of his name in her head at least a dozen times in the last few seconds, turning it over, softening it, remembering exactly how she had said it years ago. Back then, his name had always come easily shouted across fields, whispered in conspiratorial tones when they shared secrets, spoken with the casual intimacy of people who never imagined they'd be strangers. Now, the name felt fragile, dangerous. It wasn't just a word, it was a key, a bridge, a gamble. Her lungs felt tight as she drew in a slow breath. His eyes were still locked on hers, but there was something in them, something restless, conflicted. He hadn't moved, but his silence had changed. She could feel the pull between them, invisible but real, and she knew that if she didn't take this moment, it might vanish. She leaned forward ever so slightly, closing the smallest fraction of the distance. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that it barely rose above the patter of rain. His name slipped from her lips. It was almost as if the air caught it, held it suspended between them for just a second before it reached him. A single word, but it landed like a stone dropped into still water ripples, spreading out in every direction. The change in him was immediate. The gun didn't lower right away, but his grip faltered. It was in the way his knuckles eased, the way his arm lost that rigid, mechanical steadiness. His eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since he'd stepped from the shadows, he blinked too quickly, like someone pulling themselves out of a dream they weren't ready to leave. He said nothing, but his silence was no longer the cold, impassive silence of a stranger. It was the silence of someone whose defenses had just been breached. Her heart pounded so hard she thought he might hear it. She hadn't expected it to work so instantly, not this much. But there he was, standing with a gun in his hand and the past in his eyes, his mind clearly somewhere else now, and she knew exactly where he'd gone. She could almost see it in his expression, a flicker of recognition, the shadow of a smile that wasn't really there but lived in the memory of who he'd been. It was as if her whisper had pulled the boy out from behind the man's face just for a moment, just long enough for her to see him. She let the silence stretch between them, giving him space to speak if he chose to. But he didn't. Instead, his eyes dropped, just briefly, to the wet ground between them, and she caught the smallest movement of his lips, like he was mouthing something to himself. Maybe it was her name. The hand holding the gun shifted again, almost uncertain. It didn't point quite so squarely at her chest anymore. It had angled down just slightly, the difference almost invisible, but she felt it like a change in the weather. She wanted to say more, but she knew better than to rush him. Her whisper had cracked something open. Now she needed to let the air in before pushing further. The rain picked up again, washing over them in soft sheets. Somewhere behind him, a car door slammed in the distance, but he didn't react. His focus was entirely on her, like the rest of the world no longer mattered, and maybe it didn't. When she spoke again, it was softer still, the kind of tone that would have been lost in a crowd, but here felt like the only thing in the world. "It's me." His eyes met hers again, truly met them, without the barrier that had been there before. She saw recognition now, clear as the day they'd last said goodbye. The gun was still in his hand. The rain was still falling. The danger hadn't passed, But for the first time since the moment began, she felt a sliver of hope, because he remembered. The name hung in the air between them like the last echo of a bell, vibrating in the space neither of them dared to cross. The rain seemed quieter again, not gone, just muffled, as though the entire alley were listening. He didn't move. It was the stillness of someone caught between two realities, each pulling at him with equal force. His arm remained lifted, the gun still in his hand, but it wasn't quite aimed anymore. The barrel drifted just slightly lower, as though its weight had increased tenfold. She didn't speak. She barely breathed. Her eyes never left his, because she knew that one blink, one single flicker, could break this delicate suspension. The freeze wasn't just in his body. It was in his mind. She could see it there, behind his eyes. A storm of memory was breaking through whatever cold resolve had brought him here. His jaw tightened as if he were holding something in, but his fingers on the gun's grip had lost their earlier bite. For a moment, it felt like the rain was falling in slow motion, droplets tracing lazy arcs before shattering against the wet pavement. She could hear them hitting the ground in exaggerated clarity, each drop a quiet metronome counting out the seconds. 1, 2, 3. His breathing shifted shallow at first, then deeper, as though he were struggling to steady himself. The shadow of his hat brim hid part of his face, but not enough to conceal the flicker in his eyes, the unmistakable trace of recognition that was no longer just a flicker. She thought of the boy he'd been, of the days they had run barefoot in the grass, of how he used to stop in mid-sentence sometimes, lost in thought before grinning like he'd remembered something too good not to share. That boy was here now, somewhere inside this man, and she could feel him fighting his way to the surface. The tension in the alley was almost unbearable. Neither of them moved, but everything in the air shifted. The danger didn't vanish. It hung there, sharp and ready, but the certainty of it wavered. She studied him, reading the signs in his stillness, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the faint tremor in the arm holding the gun, the way his shoulders were no longer squared like a soldier on duty, but curved forward as if bracing for something heavier than rain. This was the moment, the turning point. He was deciding. Not deciding whether to kill her, that decision had been made somewhere before tonight. He was deciding whether to undo it, whether to let the past overrule the present, whether the memory of her outweighed whatever chain of events had led him here. His fingers flexed once on the grip. A droplet of rain slid along the metal barrel and fell, vanishing into the puddle between them with a faint plink. She almost flinched at the sound, not because it startled her, but because it reminded her how fragile this balance was. If someone appeared at the end of the alley right now, if a single sound broke this strange stillness, the choice might be made for him. And she knew she had no control over that. Her throat felt dry, but she swallowed. "You remember me," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet certainty. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in something closer to pain. Muscles in his jaw jumped, and for the briefest moment she thought she saw him nod. It was so faint, so quick, that she almost doubted she'd seen it at all. The gun didn't lower any further, but it didn't rise again either. He was suspended, locked between who he had been and who he'd become, unable or unwilling to move until something tipped the scale. And so they stood there, caught in that fragile space where the past and present touch, where one word or one action could rewrite everything. Neither spoke again. Not yet. The rain fell. The world waited. For him, the alley seemed to close in. The edges of the world blurred, the sound of rain becoming distant, almost hollow. The woman in front of him was no longer just a target. She was a face from a time he'd buried so deep, he'd almost convinced himself it never existed. Her voice still lingered in his ears, not the words themselves, but the way they'd sounded. Soft, deliberate, unshaken. She had spoken his name like she owned it, Like she remembered what it meant before it was twisted into a weapon. He'd prepared himself for this job with the same cold precision he brought to all the others. He'd studied her picture, memorized her routines, noted the hours when she was alone. The plan was simple: approach, execute, vanish. But that was before he'd seen her eyes. They weren't just familiar, they were the same eyes that had once looked at him like he mattered, like he was more than the circumstances he was born into, more than the mistakes he would later make. His grip on the gun tightened reflexively, not from intent, but from habit. He could feel the cold bite of the metal under his fingers, the weight of it an anchor to the present. But the present felt slippery now. It was being invaded by images he hadn't invited. A dirt road in late summer, the hum of cicadas, her hair catching the light. He remembered the way she used to tilt her head when she was listening to him, her attention so complete it made him feel taller, steadier. He remembered running with her through the rain once, both of them laughing so hard they could barely breathe. And he remembered the night he left How. Her eyes had followed him until he disappeared into the dark. He had told himself she'd forget him, that it was better that way. And yet here she was, speaking his name like it had never left her lips. His chest felt tight. His training told him to finish the job, to push through whatever this was and get it done. His handler's voice echoed in his mind, sharp and uncompromising. No hesitation. No witnesses, but she wasn't a witness. She was her. He glanced at her hands empty, steady at her sides. No pleading. No reaching. She wasn't trying to run. She was standing there as if she knew she was safe, as if the boy he used to be was still in here somewhere. He hated that she was right that the gun wavered. Only slightly, but enough that he noticed. Enough that he knew she'd noticed too. A part of him bristled at the weakness. But another part, the part he'd tried to kill long ago, clung to it like a lifeline. Memories kept flooding in, unbidden. She was sitting cross-legged in the grass, telling him about the places she wanted to see someday. He'd laughed, said those places were for other people, not for kids like them. She'd looked him straight in the eye and told him he was wrong. Nobody had ever told him that before. And now she was looking at him the same way. He realized he hadn't blinked in too long, his vision sharpening painfully on her face. Her hair was damp from the rain, strands clinging to her skin, but her expression was calm. No fear in her eyes, just recognition. The urge to say her name caught him off guard. His mouth almost formed it before he stopped himself. Speaking it would be a step, a choice. And once he took that step, he wasn't sure he could go back. He swallowed hard, trying to clear the tightness in his throat. She was still there, still. Waiting. The part of him that was still the boy from the dirt road wanted to drop the gun, close the space between them, and tell her everything, where he'd been, what he'd done, why he couldn't be that boy anymore, but the man he'd become. Knew that every second he stood here like this was a second closer to someone noticing, a second closer to his handler realizing the job wasn't done. He could almost feel the unseen clock ticking behind him. And yet, his finger had moved away from the trigger without him even noticing. For the first time in years, he didn't know what came next. The alley seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, steady, heavy, unyielding. For a moment, neither of them moved, each locked in their own corner of the storm. Her gaze held his, unwavering. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't pleading. It was something far more dangerous. It was trust. Trust that the boy she'd once known was still in there. Trust that he wouldn't pull the trigger. But outside that narrow slice of space between them, the world hadn't stopped. A sound cut through. The rain. A faint crunch of gravel at the far end of the alley, just beyond the glow of the street lamp. His head didn't turn, but his eyes flickered for a split second toward the noise. He knew it without needing to look. Someone was watching. Her brows drew together the smallest sign that she'd heard it too. The clock in his head started ticking faster now. His handler's voice again, cold and clinical. Jobs that drag are jobs that fail. He'd been standing here too long. Every second was another chance for someone to intervene. He shifted his stance, the movement small but deliberate. The gun! Angled a fraction higher again, not quite aimed at her heart, but no longer hanging in uncertainty. Her breath hitched. "Don't," she said quietly. Not a command, not a plea, just a single word layered with memory. He could feel it, whatever. Crack her name had made in him was widening. But at the same time, the pressure from the outside was closing in. Another sound from the alley's mouth. A footstep, closer this time. Whoever it was wasn't rushing, but they weren't hesitating either. His pulse spiked. If it was one of his own, they'd expect the job done. If it wasn't, if it was someone else entirely, then the scene would get messy fast. Either way, the moment he'd been frozen in would be shattered. She seemed to understand that too. Her eyes darted briefly toward the sound, then back to him, sharper now, more urgent. "You don't have to do this," she said. The problem was, he did. Or, at least, the version of him that had been walking through the world for years did. That version had been built on orders, consequences, survival. Breaking a job wasn't just dangerous. It was a death sentence. But the boy inside him, the one she kept looking at like he still existed, didn't care about that. The approaching. Footsteps stopped. Silence, except for the rain. Whoever was out there was close now, probably within sight of the alley's interior. He felt his options shrink like a noose tightening. Finish the job and the watcher might fade back into the dark. Lower the gun. And he'd have to deal with whoever was coming, and the fallout from not doing what he'd been sent to do. Her voice came again, softer but cutting through the rain like a blade. "You remember," and he did, her standing barefoot in the grass. Her laugh on that summer night. The way she'd looked at him as he'd walked away all those years ago, like she'd known she'd never see him again, but had refused to let. It looked like the end. His chest felt like it was splitting. Another sound behind him, now quicker, more definite. The watcher was moving. Time was gone. He had to choose. His fingers flexed around the grip, not in preparation to fire, but in hesitation. Every instinct from years of training screamed to get it done, walk away, disappear before the situation. Spiraled. But every pull of memory told him the moment he pulled that trigger, whatever was left of the boy she remembered would be gone forever. Her eyes never left his. Not even when the shadow at the end of the alley lengthened and a second figure began to emerge from the dark. It was now or never. The rain pounded harder, the world rushing in. And in the space of one breath, he made his choice. The choice hit him like a lightning strike, sudden, irreversible. His arm dropped, the gun's barrel pointing toward the wet ground. It wasn't a surrender so much as a refusal. The relief in her eyes was almost imperceptible, but it was there. A tiny loosening of her shoulders. A flicker of breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, but the relief didn't last. The shadow at the far end of the alley elongated, solidifying into a figure. The dim light caught a glint of metal. Another gun, this one steady and raised. Problem? The voice was male, flat, and carried the faint scrape of someone used to being obeyed. The man with a gun, her boy from Summers. Past didn't look back. "I've got it." The newcomer stepped forward, slow but sure. His boots made muted splashes in the puddles, each one a reminder that the fragile stillness they'd been holding was already cracking. Her eyes shifted between them. The new man's presence radiated a different kind of threat, not the intimate, personal weight of the standoff she'd been trapped in, but something colder. This wasn't about her as a person. This was business. The gun in the new man's hand didn't waver. Doesn't look like it. His gaze flicked down at the lowered weapon, then back up. We don't get paid for hesitation. Her boy, because no matter how much time had passed, that's how she still thought of him, finally turned. His stance tightening, his shoulders straightening as if he could block her from view with his body alone. I said I've got it. It wasn't a plea. It was a warning. The other man stopped just short of the spill of lamplight, his face half shadowed. Rain slid from the brim of his hood, running down the barrel of his weapon. Orders are orders. You know what happens when people start thinking they can rewrite them. Her boy didn't answer. She realized then that whatever choice he'd made to lower his gun, it wasn't safe yet. Not for him. Not for her. The second man's voice cut through again, sharper this time. Do it or I will. The question bloomed in her mind so suddenly she almost said it aloud. Why? Why had he been sent? Why her? Why was the boy she'd once known standing here between her and someone who seemed ready to kill her without even asking her name? She took a step forward before she could stop herself. Why me? She said. Both men looked at her now. Her boy's eyes softened just slightly, the barest flicker of something human in a face that was otherwise carved from stone. The other man's expression didn't change at all. That's above your pay. Grade, the second man said, his tone almost casual. All you need to know is you're a problem that needs solving. Her boy shifted, putting himself more squarely between them. Not tonight, he said. The silence that followed was taut, like a rope stretched to its breaking point. The second man tilted his head, studying him. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Maybe it was never supposed to be easy, her boy replied. Her heart hammered, but she didn't move. She sensed that any sudden motion could tip this standoff into gunfire, and if it came to that, she doubted either of them would walk away. The rain kept falling, pooling around their feet, carrying the faint reflection of three figures locked in a triangle of danger, and the question she'd asked hung there still, unanswered. Because deep down, she knew the truth. The answer might change everything, and not in a way she was ready to face. The rain was a curtain now, thick enough that the street lamp's glow broke into fractured halos. The three of them stood in its haze, the space between each heartbeat feeling longer than it should. Her boy's body was still in front of hers, angled so that she could see the tension in his shoulders. His stance was steady, but she could feel the coiled energy in him like a spring wound to its limit. The second man didn't flinch, didn't lower his gun. He looked perfectly comfortable in the standoff, as though this was routine for him. His voice, when it came again, was quieter but sharper, like the edge of a knife. Move, or I'll go through you. Her boy didn't move. It was a strange thing, standing behind him. She could see every small detail, the rain pooling on the sizzle symbol. Back of his coat, the slight rise and fall of his breath, the set of his jaw when he said, "Not happening." The second man took a step closer, the puddle splashing under his boots. This isn't about you. You're a trigger puller, same as me. Don't make it personal. It's already personal, he said. The rain muffled the sound of her inhale. She didn't know if she was supposed to speak, if saying something now would help or only make things worse. The second man's gun didn't waver. You know what happens to people who go soft. You've seen it. You've done it. They don't get to walk away. Her boy didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was its own kind of defiance. Seconds stretched. The new man shifted, his grip slightly, an unspoken warning that he was running out of patience. The alley felt smaller by the second, the brick walls drawing in, the sound of the rain closing them off from the rest of the world. Her boy's hand twitched, not toward the trigger, but as if steadying himself for something irreversible. She realized it before he did it. Whatever choice he was making, it wasn't going to be cautious. The second man's voice came again, low and certain. Last chance. Her boy moved. It was fast, too fast for her to track in detail. One moment the gun was hanging low at his side. The next, It was up but not pointed at her. The shot cracked like thunder in the confined alley, and the second man jerked back, his weapon clattering to the wet ground. The impact wasn't fatal. Her boy had aimed for the arm, but it was enough to send him stumbling. "Go," he said over his shoulder, his voice tight but controlled. She didn't move. Not yet. The second man swore under his breath, clutching his arm, his eyes wide with shock and fury. "You're dead," he spat. "You're both dead." Her boy stepped forward, closing the space between them, his gun still steady. "Maybe," he said, "but not tonight." The injured man's gaze shifted past him, landing on her. There was a promise in his look, a cold certainty that this wasn't over. Then he backed away, one slow step at a time, disappearing into the rain-shrouded end of the alley. Silence rushed in to fill the space he'd left, broken only by the patter of rain and the ragged sound of her breathing. Her boy turned toward her, the gun lowering again. His face was unreadable in the half-light, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A weight lifted, but also a deeper shadow. "You should go," he said. The words hit her harder than the gunshot had. "What about you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the mouth of the alley, where the darkness now seemed heavier, full of unspoken threats. "Go," he repeated, "before they send someone else." And for the first time since the night began, she realized this wasn't just a rescue. It was the start of a much bigger war. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it was heavier now, soaking through clothes, running down faces, turning the alley into a gleaming corridor of water and shadow. He stood in front of her, gun still lowered but ready, his breath visible in the chill. "You need to go," he said again, his tone firmer now, as if repeating it might finally make her move. She didn't. Not because she didn't hear him, but because every part of her was screaming against the idea of turning her back on him now. She'd just gotten him back, at least. The smallest part of him, and the thought of leaving felt like cutting the rope that tethered him to who he'd once been. "You think I'm just going to walk away?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "It's the only way you survive this. And you?" He didn't answer. That silence told her more than words ever could. Whatever lines he just crossed, refusing the order, shooting the other man, there would be no walking it back. He'd painted a target on himself as much as she had. "You can't protect me from all of it," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "Not if you're still in it." He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking until she could see the water dripping from the edge of his lashes. "You don't understand. They won't stop. They don't forget." "Then I'm not leaving you here to face them alone." Her words landed like stones in the silence. He closed his eyes for a second, as if bracing himself. The truth was, he wanted her to stay, wanted it more than he'd let himself admit. But he'd already pulled her into enough danger tonight. The longer she stayed, the worse it would get. "You staying will get you killed," he said. "Leaving will get you killed." The stare they shared now was nothing like the one in the beginning of the night. That first standoff had been tense, uncertain, dangerous. This one was raw, the danger now aimed outward, not between them. Another flash of movement at the far end of the alley caught his attention, a dark shape slipping through the rain. He didn't need to see the face to know it wasn't over. Message had already been sent. He looked back at her, urgency sharpening his voice. "Go. Now?" She shook her head. "Not without you." There it was, the line in the sand. She wasn't going to cross it, and he wasn't going to drag her over it. His gaze dropped to the ground for the briefest moment, then came back up. "Then we run." It was so simple, so sudden, that it took her a second to process it. "What? They'll come from both ends soon. Staying here means they trap us." She opened her mouth to ask where they'd go, but he was already moving, checking the shadows for threats, scanning the walls like he could see a map no one else could. Finally, he reached for her hand. It was rougher than she remembered, calloused, scarred, but when his fingers closed around hers, the grip was steady, grounding. Come on. They moved together, away from the glow of the street lamp, deeper into the web of side streets and alleys where the rain and night would swallow them whole. Somewhere behind them, the alley they'd left was already empty again, as if nothing had happened. But the echo of the choice they'd made hung in the air, trailing after them. They didn't know where the next safe place would be, or if there even was one. But the decision had been made not to run apart, but to run together. And for the first time that night, despite the cold and the danger and the shadows closing in, she felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Hope.